Right now, the smartphone industry is experiencing something of a shake-up. Sales of new devices have slowed down for the first time in years, and innovation seems to have somewhat stagnated among the flagships. But there is something interesting happening in the world of Android, and you won't find it at the higher price end, but rather at the mid-range. Devices like this Honor 10 are in many ways the most exciting handsets on the market today. They don't have any kind of big feature or gimmick. Here we find that what you get for your money is rapidly increasing, and the gap between the premium devices and these middle-of-the-roaders is rapidly decreasing. What's the big new feature to be excited about in 2018? The price. The Honor 10 is the perfect example of this, and on paper it sounds almost flagship for a fraction of the price at just £399 here in the UK. But can it really compete with your Galaxy S9s and your Huawei P20s? I'm Adam Chernitsky, and I'm going to find out in this full review. Stay tuned. Comparing the Honor 10 to the Huawei P20 is rather apt. Of course, Honor is a subdivision of Huawei, and actually in many ways, Huawei is cannibalizing its own sales in this way. So to look at right away, the Honor 10 is very similar to the Huawei P20. The thing you're going to notice, of course, is that Aurora glass, which is all over the back, and that gives it a really shimmering, shiny, really eye-catching look. So this is made by stacking 15 different layers of glass on top of each other, which then bounce light back in different ways depending on the angle that you're looking at it. I do imagine this won't be to everyone's taste. It is a little bit ostentatious, you might find it a little bit garish, but like I say, it's different, it stands out, and that's a good thing. And if you go for like the Glacier Grey, then that's a little less noticeable. And of course you can always stick a case over it anyways, but it is nice that this is a device that, you know, is a bit different, stands out from the crowd. On the front, you've got an IPS LCD display. It's 5.84 inches and 1080 by 2280p. The screen looks really nice, it's colourful, especially if you leave it in the default vivid mode. Not quite up there with an AMOLED display, of course, the blacks aren't quite as black, but definitely serviceable, more than serviceable in fact, very pleasant to watch media or play games on. The biggest downfall for me is that it's not covered in Gorilla Glass. It's covered instead in some kind of proprietary protective glass, and to me it just feels a bit more plasticky. And in fact, that's one of my complaints with the device here. In general, it feels a bit plasticky. It is made of glass, but it's a bit hollow, and it doesn't quite have that premium heft that you'll get from more expensive devices, which is fair enough for the price. I'm not saying it's horrible, I'm just saying you can feel the price difference a little bit when you pick it up. I'm also not a big fan of the haptics. There's a motor in here that buzzes when you're typing and for notifications, and it's so distracting and so loud that I can't use it next to my wife in bed while she's sleeping because it distracts her and wakes her up. It's got really thin bezels, a 19:9 aspect ratio, a very modern design in that regard, but of course it does have that notch, and this is going to be divisive for a lot of people. I have been surprised just how much some people dislike the notch, but the good news is that you can turn this off in the settings, create a black bar on either side to hide it, and whilst you can still make it out, it's basically gone, so I can't see a big reason to be that unhappy with it. It's up to you whether or not this is off-putting, but for me personally it's not, and I think most people are going to be fine with it. What is a little bit of a strange choice is that there's a fingerprint sensor down the bottom of the display, so it's got a bit of a chin, and that seems a little bit odd when you've gone to all those lengths to remove the bezel at the top, and then you leave the bezel down the bottom. What that fingerprint sensor is though is a ultrasonic fingerprint sensor, so it's something a bit different. This is supposed to be faster, and it's supposed to work even when your fingers are wet. Personally, I find it's actually a little bit slower than your regular fingerprint sensors, and seeing as there's no IP rating on this, I don't really know what the benefit of being able to open it with wet fingers is. You can open it with wet fingers, but you can't take it into a wet place. Otherwise, the design is no fireworks, no disasters. You have a headphone jack, which is good news for a lot of people. You have the speaker grill down the bottom, a single one, easy to cover up with your finger, but loud enough. I will say it's a bit quieter than several of the other mid-range devices I've used recently, especially with notifications actually and calls. Not the call volume itself, but the ringing of the phone is a bit quiet, and I've missed a couple of calls as a result. Of course you can turn this right up, but it just doesn't go quite as loud as I'd like it to. But it's perfectly fine, it will fill a room, you can have it on, watching YouTube whilst you cook in the kitchen, no problem. Meanwhile, the performance though is in many ways right up there with flagships, and the big reason for this is that it's powered by the Kirin 970 chipset. So this is the top of the range Kirin at the moment, and it's the same one found in the Huawei P20, so you're literally getting the same performance in that regard as you do from Huawei's own flagship. See what I mean about cannibalizing sales? It's an interesting strategy, but with the state of the smartphone market right now, it makes a lot of sense. So that of course means that you're going to get top of the range performance, and you'll have no problem playing all the latest games, 3D games on the Play Store. At the same time, it'll nip through the UI perfectly quickly, although with some caveats, more on that in a second. But it's not quite up there with the Snapdragon 835 when it comes to gaming performance, which is roughly the equivalent, and it's certainly not quite up there with the 845. So the Snapdragon is essentially a generation ahead of Kirin right now. So although it is the latest available, it's not the very best performance, but it's right up there, and for £399, you really can't complain about the performance here. It's backed up by 4GB of RAM, or in India there's also a 6GB variant available, I believe. But what Huawei really likes to talk about when it comes to the Kirin 970 is that NPU, the neural processing unit. This allows it to perform onboard artificial intelligence and machine learning, so it can do things like recognize things in a scene, smarter memory management based on the way you use the device, even organize your photos. So I'll be talking more about that as it relates to the camera in a moment, but that's one advantage of having the Kirin 970. The face unlock feature is super quick. I think it's really good actually, one of the best, and I'd say that probably comes down to that NPU. So in many ways this is a top performing smartphone for just £399. One thing that is a mark against performance slightly is the addition of EMUI or Emotion UI. This is an Android skin that's on top of Android 8.1, and it changes the look for starters, which a lot of people don't like. It's very colourful and very garish, but fortunately you can change this by installing a separate launcher and doing other customizations. But at the same time, I think it also hurts the performance, and you notice this when doing things like swiping through the image gallery, where I noticed a bit of a stutter, which I don't think would have been there otherwise, considering the chipset that this is running. That said, EMUI does have its benefits. For instance, it's apparently very good with memory management. I find it's a little bit aggressive in that regard actually, but again, it's a matter of opinion. It's also got some cool gestures, for instance, a one-handed mode. You can swipe to the right and then everything shrinks down and you can navigate it easily like that. That's quite useful. There are other gestures, a knuckle gesture and things, so you might like EMUI, some people do. Personally, I would have preferred something closer to stock. The battery is 3,400 mAh, and that's perfectly fine to see through a day in most cases. I haven't had any problems there. My average screen on time is just under 6 hours, which is fairly standard. There is quick charging, but no wireless charging, despite this being a glass device. And that brings us to the camera. It's a 16 megapixel primary shooter backed up by a 24 megapixel monochrome lens. And Honor's been doing this for a long time. The idea of that monochrome lens is to increase the dynamic range, to provide more data to feed into those images. And I would say it probably works pretty well because the contrast is good, there's good variation between colors, and on the whole, I'm pretty happy with the way photos turn out. Also an f1.8 aperture, so you can do those nice depth of field effects and actually control the aperture in the Pro mode as well as in the aperture mode. And then at the front, you've got a 24 megapixel camera, which is really generous, really high definition for a selfie camera. But what everyone's talking about when it comes to this camera, or what Honor wants everyone to be talking about, is the AI capabilities. This is an AI camera, it says so proudly right across the back. And what that means is that if you point this camera at something, it will recognize what's in the shot and it will change the settings accordingly. So that means if you point it at food, it's gonna maybe change the settings so that there's greater detail. If you point it at flowers, it might turn up the saturation. It's not actually more true to life though, it's just what your phone thinks is better. So it really depends on just whether you agree with the AI, whether the AI likes what you like. You're either going to love this or you're going to hate it. The good news is you can turn it off if you don't like it, and it's still cool to have, just to toy around with. It's a neat party trick. Unfortunately, there's no optical image stabilization, but there is EIS, and this works really well actually. It's one of the best implementations of EIS I've seen. Probably once again, you're getting some benefit from that AI functionality. Low light performance is really good as well, even though it loses some of the low light features found on the Huawei P20. It's not a perfect story here though. I will say that the autofocus isn't particularly good on this camera. Sometimes images end up looking a little bit soft. I will say that this isn't quite a flagship camera. It's not going to compete with, a Pixel 2, but it is a really good camera. It's capable of really good shots if you're going to work at it. And the reason that I like this camera more than a lot of other cameras with similar specs or similar performance is that it's got so much to play around with. You've got light painting, for instance, which I absolutely love. You've got an artist mode. So yeah, there's just a lot to play around with. It's a really fun camera. I really like that about it. I like that about all Honor phones. So yeah, on the whole, this is a fun device, but at the same time, it's also a really impressive device in terms of what you're getting for the money. I did want to point out some of the flaws and nitpick a little, but like I say, those are nitpicks. I want you to know what it's like to use, that it isn't quite as premium as a top-of-the-range device, but anything on top of what you're getting here is a luxury, so there's no need to spend more than that. The performance and what you can do with it is right up there with the best on the market, and that's really quite incredible. It's going to be really interesting to see how those top-of-the-range flagships can compete with this kind of value and what they're going to do to justify those massive prices. Google, Samsung, Apple, it's your move. The only problem is that there's at least 2 other devices that also offer incredible value for money these days at around this price point, those being the Nokia 7 Plus and the OnePlus 6, so stay tuned for comparison videos looking at how they stack up. So yeah, what do you think? Is this the start of a new era? Are we going to start seeing smartphone prices fall? Or more importantly, what do you think of the Honor 10? Let me know in the comments down below. Like this video if you enjoyed it and share it around. That really helps us out. We really appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more like this. Hit the bell button for notifications. Head over to the full written review over at androidauthority.com where you'll find more depth, more details, etc. And whilst you're there, take a look around, for we are your source for all things Android.